Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the kickoff of our Boys Town Fall Newborn Expo. My name is Gabby, joined here with Dr. Sawyer, who is a Boys Town pediatrician, and today we are going to be discussing all things breastfeeding. Now, since this is the kickoff of our Newborn Expo, I have a few reminders I want to give before we get started. So make sure you fill out the RSVP form that is linked above this video, and you can actually be entered to get a newborn bundle. We're giving away newborn bundles to the first 250 registrants and still have a few spots left. And as well, we are doing in-person meet and greets next week with our Boys Town pediatricians. So that is on November 10th. We'll also link the form for that to sign up for a slot. And of course, make sure you like this video. And if you have a question about breastfeeding, you can leave it in the comments here for Dr. Sawyer to answer. Okay, with all the housekeeping aside now, Dr. Sawyer, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me again, Gabby.
Yes, of course. It's great to have you on. We've done a few newborn expos now, and Dr. Sawyer has been a lovely guest, so make sure you go back and watch those. But as far as today goes, we're talking all things breastfeeding. Okay, so let's get right into the questions here. Dr. Sawyer, the first question is, what do pregnant moms who are considering breastfeeding need to know about it?
It's a big topic, certainly. I think the most important thing to know is that we as pediatricians think that it's a good idea to consider breastfeeding, and we encourage it. I breastfed 3 children, and I know how beneficial it is and was to my own babies, but also that it comes with challenges. So I think equipping ourselves with the knowledge to have a good foundation for breastfeeding is really important. I also really encourage women to reach out to their doctors, lactation consultants, sisters, mothers, people who have experience with breastfeeding ahead of time to have them in place for when they start breastfeeding their own babies. And so they have people that they can ask questions and have there as a support system.
Yes. We always say at Boys Town, it takes a village. And with breastfeeding, it's really no different. So I love that you said that. There's plenty of resources, whether it be within Boys Town, with family, friends, that can help you along your journey.
Exactly.
The next question we got submitted is, should pregnant moms be eating more of any certain foods or taking supplements besides a prenatal to prepare for breastfeeding?
Yeah, I get asked this question quite a bit. And I like to keep it as simple as possible. That's kind of my mantra with a lot of things. I think women who are breastfeeding, and I think their OBs will agree that they should continue with their prenatal vitamin while they're breastfeeding. That's really important just to help to get some extra vitamins, minerals, and necessary things into their body while they're breastfeeding. I think making sure that you're eating a healthy, balanced diet is important. So regular meals, couple snacks a day. I don't think a lot of women realize that breastfeeding requires a lot of calories from our bodies. And so you really should be trying to get some more healthy, calorie-dense foods in while you're breastfeeding. I think the recommendation is about 300 to 400 extra calories a day to get into your diet compared to before you were pregnant. So keeping that in mind that, you are producing food for another human and you need extra calories to be able to produce that food for another human. And then really staying well hydrated is really important. So drinking lots of water. Water it's good for you and it will help with your breast milk production. And then also just being careful with excess caffeine. A little caffeine's fine, but avoiding too much caffeine. And then also being careful with alcohol. In moderation is fine when you're breastfeeding, smaller amounts, but obviously not overdoing it because we don't want it to be secreted in large amounts into our breast milk. And also those things can affect our supply if we're overdoing them. And then last, I think a lot of people don't talk about it quite as much, but it's getting to be more common in our society. Marijuana use, I try to talk about with women. It actually does get excreted quite a bit into breast milk. So really avoiding marijuana use while you're breastfeeding.
Yeah, it's great to know. I forgot to mention too, at the beginning, we are doing giveaways, just as we always do in our Newborn Expo. So if you want to be included in a giveaway, we're giving away prizes every day. Make sure you fill out that same RSVP form that I have linked above this video, and we'll draw winners at the end of the day. Okay, so the next question is, let's talk a little bit about like time commitment. What is the time commitment for breastfeeding in those early weeks and then again as baby ages?
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to be upfront with moms that breastfeeding is a commitment, but you're there bonding with your baby already. So your commitment is that you're going to be feeding your baby maybe every 1 to 3 hours for quite a while.
Yeah.
And that can be through the night too. So realizing that it can be demanding as far as your sleep cycles and things like that. But you've got to feed your baby anyway. And there are pluses and minuses to breastfeeding. Certainly breastfeeding, it can be time consuming, the fact that you feed your child and they have to be connected to you when you're feeding them that way. But you also don't have to be necessarily preparing a bottle or, warming up formula or cleaning your bottle or things like that. So, when you're thinking about breastfeeding and the time commitment to it, I think thinking about it another way and thinking about it in the way that you just nourish your child, and it can simplify things a little bit just to be breastfeeding. And it's also time that you're going to spend feeding your child anyway. So I don't really think like people should think about it in a way of, breastfeeding is so much more demanding or bottle feeding so much more demanding. You're going to be spending the same amount of time feeding your baby often. So, yep.
Yeah. And then, as far as like longevity, I know it's kind of up to a lot of moms to decide about how long to breastfeed.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a typical age where people stop, or tell me about
Right. So we recommend exclusively breastfeeding until 6 months of age, and then starting to do solids. Some babies, I'll talk to parents and they'll be like, well, they seem really ready for it at 4 to 6 months, and that's fine. We have to have a little bit of ability to like go with the flow with our babies too, especially if they're really far along in their motor skills and sitting up and things like that. But so exclusively breastfeeding until about 6 months of age is what we recommend. And then once you start doing your solids, we still recommend breastfeeding. If it's beneficial to you and your baby and you feel like things are going well, as long as you can breastfeed is good for your baby and for you. At least until a year. And now some new recommendations are recommending until 2 years. Honestly, I have moms and myself, when I was breastfeeding, all of my babies were different. Some of them wanted to breastfeed longer than others. Some of them were easier to breastfeed. Some of them, when I was, I had more time to pump or I didn't have more time to pump. It's just kind of what naturally happens. But I really, really recommend that women breastfeed their babies as long as it's mutually beneficial. So that means that it's beneficial for baby and for mom. And I think we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I think it's really important to not lose sight of mom in this too. There's a lot of pressures that go into being a mom and a mom of a baby and breastfeeding, especially if you're working or outside of the home a lot, trying to balance what's good for mom and baby.
Yeah. The next question is, what does cluster feeding look like and how do I manage that?
So cluster feeding is not easy to manage, I would say. It's not something to be managed, but it's something just to expect. As after a baby's delivered, your breast milk is going to initially be something called colostrum, which is a really calorie-rich milk that's kind of a golden color, but it's not very much volume-wise. It's what your baby needs to get through those first days of life, certainly. But when that comes in and baby's thirsty or hungry, they're going to want to feed quite often. And the reason they feed quite often is to encourage your breast to continue to make milk and to increase milk. And so they'll oftentimes feed every half an hour to an hour and cluster in that kind of pattern for an hour or two. And then they may space out for a couple hours and then they might have another cluster of that. And that can happen not just in the newborn period, but as babies are having growth spurts, or if your milk supply for some reason is going down a little bit, it might be a way that baby's trying to encourage your milk supply to increase. There's lots of different reasons for cluster feeding, but it's a pretty natural physiologic thing that happens to allow your baby to try to increase your milk supply. To stay sane during those cluster feeding times, I think it's really important to have good support and ways to be able to get a little bit of separation between you and your baby the best you can, because you do need some time to go to the bathroom, to eat lunch. We talked about nutrition, all those things. So if you're always feeding, it's not going to allow you to be able to do some of the necessary things that you need to do. So having a partner or somebody to be able to take the baby for a little while, if you're comfortable initiating a pacifier, that can sometimes allow a little space in between feedings, but also just accepting that sometimes your baby's going to want to feed frequently, and that's pretty much a normal thing.
Yeah, and make sure you stay tuned this week too, because we are doing one of our Expo lives on balancing responsibilities with babies. So this is, a great time for that to kind of come into play. The next question is, what breastfeeding equipment is recommended? Do I need to get a pump right away? If I'm pregnant now and considering breastfeeding, what do I need to get?
So there's a few things I recommend. Once again, try to keep it simple, but I do think that a really a nice double electric breast pump is a good idea. Most insurances will cover it. You can get your OB to write a prescription for you. But I do recommend getting them pretty early on. The other thing I recommend getting that I didn't know about, I don't know if they really were around before I had my my second and my third, but it would be a breast collection device. It's just a little silicone hand pump that you can get, or they make other ones, but they're called breast milk collection devices, and they can help you collect milk, like when you're leaking and you're feeding from the other side, or you're pumping on one side. It can allow you just collect that extra milk and not waste, which I think is kind of a nice thing, because you don't really want to waste any of that milk. And then I also recommend, sometimes our breasts or our nipples get tender, irritated from initial feedings, and getting like a nice cool pack, or they make something called Soothy gels you can put in your breast or in your bras to provide some cold or ice to your breasts or your nipples after you feed. I think those things are kind of nice things to have when you're starting to breastfeed. The other thing is just make sure you have like a lanolin or a nipple cream or ointment that you can use to help keep your nipples in good shape.
Awesome. Should I try to exclusively breastfeed as long as I can before pumping and using bottles?
So that's a complicated question, but I do recommend trying to only breastfeed the first couple weeks until you really feel like you got it before you start doing bottles. That being said, there are reasons that we initiate bottles earlier, and it's pretty typically just okay. It's fine. It doesn't mess anything up. It doesn't make anything go wrong if you have to use a bottle or you have to supplement. But those 2 weeks, I mean, when I talk to women, I say, expect that those 2 weeks are going to be your trial and error period, the time for your baby to get going with breastfeeding well. It can sometimes take up to 2 weeks, and just kind of for you guys to get into sync before you start doing bottles. That being said, I think it is important to, after that point, start to think about every once in a while doing a bottle feed. Number one, it helps share some of the feeding responsibility with a partner. So if you really haven't slept for a couple nights and you need to get in a good block of sleep, you have somebody give that baby a bottle. The other thing is that if you are going to plan to go back to work, or you're going to have to be away from your baby in the future, you need to try to do some bottles here and there to get them prepared for the fact that they're eventually going to need to take bottles. one of my babies hated bottles, and it was a pain. And he really, like, to transition to daycare was a little harder because of that. I mean, we still made it work, but it can make it a little easier if they're used to taking a bottle here and there. So, I mean, certainly for breastfeeding, if you're breastfeeding and it's going well, starting a bottle after 2 weeks is not going to hurt anything. And like I said earlier on, if you need to, once again, is fine. We can help you through that.
Great. The next question we have, looks like we've got about 4 or 5 more questions. So if you are watching live and you have a question for Dr. Sawyer on breastfeeding, please leave it in the comment section now or message our page directly if you'd like your question to be private, and we can answer it here at the end.
Ask away.
Yes. Okay, this is a good one that I don't think we've talked about before. When beginning to pump, how do I know what size flanges to get?
Flange, yep. So they're like the little cone guys that that you see as part of the breast pump kit. And it is important to get the right size. There are a lot of sizing guides online, so I would recommend you either look at your pumps guide or online because you can order different sizes, or sometimes the breast pumps will come with multiple sizes. When you're looking at the pump or the flange, they're see-through, and for good reason, because you want to see the milk that's expressed and coming out, but you also need to see where your nipple's hitting. You want your nipple to be inside the little tunnel and not rubbing up against the sides. But also you don't want your flange to be so big that a large part of your areola, or the brown part around your nipple, is coming into the flange, if that makes sense. So just your nipple should be in there, but also not rubbing against the sides. So that's kind of like the down and dirty way of making sure that it's the right size for you. If your nipple is hitting the sides, you don't want that, because it's gonna rub when it's pumping, and you don't want that to happen to your nipple. And then if it's too big, too much of your areola is going to come in there, it's not going to express milk as effectively, and it also might irritate your breast once again. So kind of finding that happy middle where you maybe have a couple millimeters around circumferential around your nipple will be the right size for you.
So would you recommend maybe, during pregnancy, getting a few different sizes and kind of testing them out, or just waiting?
I would probably wait. Usually most women will be in the middle size, but they're pretty easy to find. You can find them in like Target or Walmart. And they're pretty interchangeable for most breastfeeding or breast pump kits.
Perfect. What advice do you have, for getting on a good schedule between breastfeeding and pumping?
So, that's another kind of complicated thing, because it depends on where you are with your breastfeeding and also where your baby's at. So initially, like I said, the first 2 weeks, try not to pump, but if you need to, because sometimes people make a lot of milk and their baby's only taking about an ounce after they're born per feed. So if you're making a lot of milk, you may need to pump off some of that milk so that you relieve your breasts, which is fine. So I tell people, if you really feel like baby's not pumping or not eating enough off per feed, then just pump after the feed to try to get some off and store it for when you need a bottle in the future. So that can be helpful. The other time, sometimes in the middle of the night, if babies are sleeping a little bit longer, doing a pumping session there can help, bank your milk and get you some milk so that you can store it later on. But everybody's going to kind of find their own rhythm, and it's hard to dictate because there's no real schedule. Babies are, like I said, sometimes they're going to want to feed a lot more frequently. And so you'll know when your baby wants to do that more, or if they're better sleepers at night, then you may want to pump if you're feeling uncomfortable and you feel like you need to relieve some milk off of your breasts, then that might be the time where you just naturally need to pump. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of a balancing act, because you never want to pump so much that your baby, if you're breastfeeding, that your baby doesn't get the milk. So you're gonna kind of figure out that rhythm and know just kind of naturally where your breasts are, usually about 1 to 2 months in.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Lots of trial and error.
It is. Yep. And that's why it's nice to have support.
Yes.
Yep.
Sure. Okay, what tips do you have for managing over and under supply?
So let's start with undersupply. So undersupply can start from the get-go. Women just might not feel like they're producing enough. Certainly for undersupply, you want to make sure that somebody's evaluating your baby's latch and making sure that they're actually feeding efficiently. Because if they're not, and if they're not stimulating the breast to produce good milk, then there's things we can do to help that, and it will just naturally help your breast produce more milk. So making sure that you have your latch evaluated and how your baby's transferring the milk. The other thing, if you're not a very good milk producer, you can do is after every feed with your baby, try to pump a little bit off, because just naturally your body, if it's getting demanded, if more milk is being demanded off of it by feeding and pumping, it should naturally start to increase that supply. The last thing to do is to make sure that you're at least feeding or pumping at least 8 to 12 times in a 24-hour period to produce good amount of breast milk, which if you do the math is every 2 to 3 hours. So that's a lot, but it is what is required for most women to produce the right amount of milk for their baby's nutrition, at least the first few months. So if you're underproducer, those are like just the general things you can do. If you feel like, and your baby's doctor feels like baby's just not getting enough and you're not creating enough milk, you can talk to your OB too. There are certain medications and things that they can prescribe to help you produce more milk, but that gets to be a little bit more complicated. So always consulting with your doctor, your pediatrician, and your OB is a good way to go if you just feel like you really don't produce enough milk and you need that to help with the nutrition of your baby. Overproduction can be just as tricky and frustrating for moms because they always feel like they're just completely full. The important thing there is to not be over pumping and trying to do the least amount of stimulation for milk as possible. So making sure that your baby is feeding and that you're not over pumping after. A lot of women will start pumping a lot because they're worried about work. So they'll start pumping and banking, but then they're stuck with lots and lots of milk production. So backing off the pumping can be really helpful there. And that's about it. I mean, you kind of got to go by supply and demand. And sometimes women just make extra. So they're going to have to pump off a little bit more just to be comfortable, but trying to balance that with not over pumping, because once again, you're kind of going to be chasing your tail if you're doing it too much.
Yes. I see a couple great questions here in the comment section. Thank you
Sure.
for leaving those. We'll get them answered here in just a moment. So if you're watching live, leave a question. Okay, so a couple more here. When switching from breast milk to formula or starting to combo feed, what does that switch look like? Do I taper the baby off breast milk? Can I switch it right over? What if my baby refuses formula? There's a lot of situations here.
If you feel like your milk supply is going down or you feel like you're going to need to switch to formula, I would try to do the transition as soon as you can, or try the transition as soon as you can, because as you touched on at the end of that question, sometimes babies just don't like the difference in taste. So getting them used to it. They will generally drink formula if they need to. It may take a couple feeds or a half a day of them not drinking very well, and that freaks out mom. But usually babies won't go on a full hunger strike. So know that that's really rare for that to happen, but it can be kind of scary if you do need to switch to formula very quickly. Things you can do to make that transition easier would be to, once again, have initiated a bottle earlier on so that they're used to at least taking breast milk by bottle. And then you can try to just go straight up formula, and that's fine. Or you can also start to do maybe 3/4 breast milk, 1/4 formula for a few feeds, and then go half breast milk, half formula. Just make sure that you are mixing the formula separate from the breast milk so that you get the right mix. Okay. So always follow that formula mixing instruction. And then you mix them together once you have the formula mixed. Okay. Don't use your breast milk as a water component, because that's not going to be the right nutrition for your baby. Okay. And then just making sure if that's the way you want to go and you feel like that's the way that the baby tolerates it better, just kind of the gradual change in amounts of breast milk per formula.
Awesome. This one's pretty common. We got this question a couple of times. My baby's teeth are starting to come in and it hurts my nipple while breastfeeding. How can I alleviate that?
That's every mom's nightmare. So first of all, when your baby's teeth start coming in, generally it's going to be the bottom two. And usually get one before the other. A lot of times babies at that age will start to like bite just because they're uncomfortable and the biting relieves pressure. So what I would recommend if your baby's biting you with those new teeth, to unlatch the baby, you need to unlatch by breaking the seal, put your finger in the corner, get the baby off. You can say no gently to your baby, give him a couple minutes, him or her a couple minutes, and then you relatch. I would keep repeating that every time they bite you because they need to realize that they're not going to get rewarded for biting.
Right.
And if they want to eat, then they better not bite. And it's kind of training them. It's going to take a little time to get them used to that. That being said, I mean, I think most babies will do it once or twice, and then they get past the point and they realize, oh, breastfeeding is not biting.
Yeah.
It's trying to find relief for them outside of breastfeeding for that teething, though. So if your baby's really cranky and got really swollen gums, maybe just doing a dose of Tylenol might help them. The other thing is like having like a cool teething ring or something for them to gnaw on otherwise, or like a cooled off pacifier or something like that might provide them a little bit of relief before they try to latch and breastfeed.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And then just nipple care, okay? Making sure that you're using your lanolin or your nipple creams or ointments. That can go a long way too.
For sure. How do we manage breastfeeding when introducing foods to baby? Do I breastfeed before they eat their solid foods, after? How does that work?
I would not let feeding your baby solids really change your schedule for breastfeeding that much. When we start feeding our baby solids, it's just to really get them tastes and textures, and it's whatever fits with your meal schedule. Okay. So if you're breastfeeding, I just breastfeed like you would normally, and then, oops, it's mealtime. I want to try something. Just give them a little bit of something. It's not going to take away that drive for them to really want to breastfeed.
Gotcha.
That being said, as they get a little bit older, if they're taking larger meals or bigger amounts of food, you might notice that they just naturally don't want to feed as often, and that's okay. And also that they might not feed as long, and that's okay too. So it's more of a natural thing, not that you have to like really schedule your breastfeeding around the feedings. But you may notice that some feeds are just a little less than they used to be, or that they go a little longer between feeds. But it takes a while for babies really to increase their solid nutrition to a point where it starts to take over for what they're getting nutrition-wise by breast milk. I tell moms that their primary nutrition until they're 1 is going to be their breast milk or their formula. So know that the solids do not replace that.
Awesome. All right, we have a couple more questions here, and then we'll get into the questions in the comments. This one says, I feel like breastfeeding is taking a mental toll on me and I want to stop, but I feel bad. Any advice?
Yep, that question says it all. I think that's the answer to the question. It's taking a mental toll on mom. Mom needs, I talk to my moms a lot about this. You need to be in a good place to take care of yourself and your baby. And that's the most important thing. And a fed baby is what's important. So if a fed baby means you feeding your baby formula and you being happier with your baby and with your attachment, then that's what you need to do. And it's okay. And try not to feel so guilty about what expectations are placed on us as moms. And I think that, asking for support in that too, and the people in your life, it can be hard because some people can be judgmental around this issue. But I think it's really important, once again, to know that what matters most is that your baby is fed and that you feel connected and attached to your baby. And if you're also feeling down or depressed or anxious about your baby, to talk to your doctor too. I think it's really important. that we keep recommending and encouraging moms to reach out if they're feeling like they are overwhelmed, or that any aspect of being a new mom is becoming too much.
Mm-hmm. And it's just like what you said at the beginning, making sure that what we're doing is mutually beneficial for both mom and baby. So,
Exactly. Yep. Because a baby is not going to be a happy, thriving baby unless mom is there mentally and physically for them. So just making sure that we're supporting mom in this, and we're not losing sight of the fact that mom is a big part of breastfeeding and taking care of baby. So.
Oh, yes. Alrighty, let's hop into these questions here. We answered already about babies teething, so I'm going to skip that one. What tips do you have for working moms that are breastfeeding? That's a question.
Yeah, so working moms and breastfeeding, it honestly depends on, unfortunately, in today's day and age, how supportive your workplace is. So being prepared, know their policies, know what to advocate for. If you want to breastfeed and you want to pump at work, you should be allowed a place to be able to do that, and realistic timeframes to be able to do that. But it's going to depend on your workplace policy. So look at that ahead of time, and try to plan out what you're going to do. I talked about earlier the importance of trying to breastfeed or pumping about 8 to 12 times in a 24-hour period to keep up our breast milk. A lot of women see when they go back to work that they start to decrease their milk supply. It's kind of just a natural thing when you're not breastfeeding your baby all the time. That tends to happen. But the ways to try to equip yourself to be able to still breastfeed through a transition to work is to make sure that you're trying to get in those times to pump and to breastfeed when you're with your baby, so that the baby can continue to increase and encourage your milk supply. And then also, if you know that you're going to work and you're producing a good amount of milk, freezing it and storing it for when your milk supply starts to go down can be really helpful and just help you be able to feed a little longer. Mm-hmm. I had that problem with like all three of my kids, I will be honest. At about 6 months, I would hit a kind of a wall where my milk supply would start to go down, and I would change my pump settings. I would, change the little, I can't remember, the little seal guys, just to make sure everything was most efficient. And that would help for a while. But just knowing that, sometimes you have to supplement with bank breast milk, and sometimes you sometimes need to supplement with formula, and that's okay too. Okay. Anytime that you need to introduce formula is fine. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And actually during the last Newborn Expo we did here, we have a whole video on preparing to go back to work after baby. So I'll link that in the comments.
That'd be great. Yep, there's a lot that goes along with it, emotionally and physically. So, yep.
Yes, definitely. We're here for you during that time. The next one is, does the delivery hospital provide a lactation consultant, or is that someone you need to find ahead of time?
They'll have lactation support there. So, and usually it's a daily thing, and you can request to have extra. So most of the labor and delivery nurses have some training in it as well. So ask away. All right. Also ask the pediatrician who comes around. And a lot of our clinics here at Boys Town also have lactation support, if not in that clinic, available by phone call. So just know that we're here after baby's discharged too.
The next one is, do you breastfeed immediately when the baby is delivered, or do they start with formula at the hospital and then switch over to breastfeeding?
So breastfeed right away. It would be the recommendation. If you're going to breastfeed, there's a period right after baby is born, and that they set baby on your belly, and they try to get your baby to latch for the first time. And a lot of times they will, which is pretty miraculous and amazing. But we know that, the baby latching and trying to feed and giving those attempts, those first 24 hours really does encourage that colostrum to come in, and then your breast milk just to really start to be produced in the next few days. So it is really important to start early. And I would have tried to avoid formula unless you really need to for whatever reason after your baby's delivered. If you're going to breastfeed, try to just do the breastfeeding. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so it looks like that's it for the user comments. If you are watching this video later on after it premieres live and you still have a question for Dr. Sawyer, go ahead and either comment it below or message our page privately, and I can pass your question along to get it answered. Okay, so what else do you think, Dr. Sawyer, is important to know for new moms breastfeeding in their journeys? Is there anything we haven't covered?
I think I just like to highlight the fact that it is extremely beneficial, extremely rewarding if you're able to breastfeed your baby. But it also comes with challenges. And so once again, just making sure that you feel supported by your doctor, your nurse, your friend, your family, having support and your partner too. And then also have the expectation that it's sometimes works really well from the get-go. Some babies just really take to it really quickly, and some babies it takes a little trial and error, and know that either way is possible and probable. And once again, that I would give a mom, 2 weeks to feel like they really got it down with their baby. And sometimes it takes even longer than that. But for that to be a realistic expectation, to know that you're just not going to be this well-oiled breastfeeding machine
Right away.
from day one or day two. It takes some trial and error. So
give yourself grace.
Yep, expectations. Know that not everything falls in line right away, and that's just kind of how parenthood is anyway. So it's a good early teaching tool, but that it is really a rewarding experience, and I really encourage women to consider doing it.
Awesome. The last question here is, what resources does Boys Town Pediatrics offer for breastfeeding moms?
So we have a lot of things online, as you've already talked about, and these kind of talks can be helpful. We also have just us. We're here. We're here to talk to you about it at your baby's early out visits. If you're coming to do a meet and greet with us, we're more than happy to talk about breastfeeding. Our nurses are really good about breastfeeding. And then once again, we have lactation nurses that are available too. So we'd like to have you covered the best we can and just provide as much support to make it successful for you.
Yes. And like I said at the beginning, we are doing in-person meet and greets if you're local to Omaha here on November 10th. So that link is in the comment section for you to sign up for a slot. I'll also make sure to link several other breastfeeding resources, some of which I mentioned in this chat. And to make sure you tune in tomorrow for our next live video of the Newborn Expo. We're going to be live with Dr. Micah Ryan talking all about how to keep babies safe and healthy during the holiday season. So thank you so much for watching. Dr. Sawyer, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Gabby.
Of course. Make sure you like this video, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.